So today we'll be moving ahead with the basics of photography. I'll be covering few points that formulate the structure and language on how photography is done. The points being the exposure triangle, the ISO, the aperture, the shutter speed. I'll also be telling you about what are they and what happens with them. Further in the video, I'll be giving examples of a slow and fast shutter speed image, a higher and lower ISO image, and the higher and lower aperture image. So if you're a beginner in photography, the three elements that I'm going to talk about will somehow develop and enhance your skills as you try them today. And trust me, they're very easy, so here we go. We first learn on what makes an image, the most important element of them being the exposure. For those of you who are beginning photography, exposure is possibly the key to capturing a great image. Learning how exposure works will also help you to take control of your camera and take better photos. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO are the elements that combine to create an exposure. As soon as you learn, these elements have an effect on more than just the exposure. They also cause alterations in the depth of field, motion blur, and digital noise. Once you understand how each of these works, you can now start diving into the manual mode. Considering that you're a beginner photographer, a lot of you must be using auto mode a lot. Once you crack these points, once you start experimenting and exploring these particular principles and points, you'll have a clearer image of how all these settings come together. And basically this is where you start taking control back from your camera. So one of the very important or the very easy things to learn all these settings is by the use of the exposure triangle. When combined, they control the amount of light captured from any given scene. This will also help you to understand that changing one setting will necessitate a change in the others. So this is where all of them come together. So what you can see on the screen right now is the exposure triangle that is having the ISO, the aperture, shutter speed, formulating and coming up together. So for example, in ISO you see the number goes from 100 to 6400 and so on. In shutter speed it goes from 1 to 1 by 250 and so on. And in aperture it goes from f2.8 to f22. So we'll start defining these three elements. So first we start with the aperture. So exposure happens in three steps. We will start with the aperture. This is basically the hole inside the lens through which the light passes. It can also be compared and it is very quite similar to the pupil of our eye. Coming from a background of ophthalmology, it was easy for me to understand of how both of them come together and how they are both relatable. So I'll give you an example. When you move from a darker room to a brighter room, the size of a pupil gets very small. Similarly, that's how a camera functions too. The wider the aperture, the more light is allowed in, and vice versa. Simple, well, not quite. As the aperture widens, the f number gets lower and more light is allowed into the camera. This is great for low light, but be aware that it's going to make the depth of field very shallow, and it's not ideal while making landscapes. So a better example of this would be given that a wider aperture is best for portraits, while a narrower aperture is best for landscapes. So for a portrait image, I'll consider the aperture being f2.8, and for a narrow aperture for a landscape, I'll consider the aperture as f22. So basically this helps you to define of how the functioning of the aperture take place. And basically as the aperture widens, the f number gets lower and more light is allowed into the camera. And further, if we move ahead, so there's a bit of give and take, and as I go full in detail in this particular video. The aperture is the preferred setting to set first, as it directly influences of how much of your scene is in focus. But if you're looking to create motion blur, then it is second to the shutter speed, as shutter speed defines of how you're trying to capturize your subject. Exposure will also be very much easier to learn or memorize if you memorize the f-stop scale, which goes from f1.4 to f2 2.8 and so on. So considering of what they provide you, for example, a f1.4 would provide you a very shallow depth of field, while a f5.6 will provide you a better depth of field, while a f22 will provide you the greatest depth of field. So just like I said before, a f22 would be ideal for a landscape, and a f1.4, f2, f2.8 would be ideal for a portrait image. The second element we move to is the shutter speed. So once the light has passed through the aperture of the lens, it reaches a shutter, just like the shutter of our eye. Now you need to decide how much of that light you're going to allow into the camera. Ordinarily, you want a very small fraction of a second, for example 1 by 250, to prevent a motion blur. However, different shutter speed complement different situations. For example, anything from really fast, that is 1.4 thousand or 1.3 thousand for a sports photography, to really slow 30 seconds for night photography or if you're trying to capture a moving river or a water body. It all depends on what you're shooting and how much light you have available to you. Knowing how your shutter speed works is possibly the key elements in the basics of photography, and you can possibly do a lot of experiments with shutter speeds. The other point that we move ahead is the ISO. So once the light has passed through the aperture and have been filtered by the shutter speed, it reaches the sensor. So this is where you start deciding on how to set the ISO. So as you turn the ISO number up from, for example, from 100 to 1200, you increase the exposure, but at the same time, the image quality decreases. There will be no longer the digital lines or grain. So if you have to decide upon your priorities in terms of exposure versus grain, for example, I would reduce the image quality if it meant that I could prevent motion blur in my photo. There is no possible way to fix that in post-production. And yeah, that's basically defines of how these three elements would work together. Another very important aspect that I want you all to know, which completely changes the way we look at photography and it completely changes the idea of it, is the idea of perspective and the way you experiment with it, in which basically the exact same scene can often look very different when approached from a different angle, and capturing a subject from above or below may change the whole feel and look of a photograph. So now, not every angle might work for a photograph, or of course it might just do, but you'll never know until you experiment and explore. It's just about those hit and trials that makes you come up with a unique image. So I'll give you an example. For example, when you're shooting animals or children, you can try getting down to their level. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to capture the world through their eyes. And another example that I want you all to know is, for example, if you're shooting a portrait, why not stand on a bench and shoot your object from above? So here what you're doing is you're trying to play with levels and come up with different ideas of it. The pictures coming ahead would make you realize and see that how I've used the idea of experimentation as perspective. So one of the pictures is upside down, which I completely changed the angle of my lens just to produce the reflection of the subject that I was capturing. Another image is of a wide angle lens and about how I wanted to capture the grandeur of the place. The other two pictures are in which I have used the idea of lines and geometry. So yeah, that's about the how you play with perspectives. Another important rule is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is based on the idea that pictures are generally more interesting and well balanced when they aren't centered. For example, imagine a grid placed over images with two vertical lines and two horizontal lines that divide the picture into 9 equal sections. So if you're following the rule of thirds, rather than positioning your subject or the important elements of a scene at the center of the photo, you place them along one of the 4 lines or at the points where the lines intersect. Some cameras even have a grid option you can turn on, which can be useful if you're still learning to compose images. This is something that you can find in your phones or cameras. Almost every smartphone has this feature, so you won't have to struggle with it. Photography is basically all about creativity and personal expression. So you may sometimes choose to break this rule and place the points of interest elsewhere in your photo. So it's absolutely up to you. It's just about finding those points of interest and where you want to place them. Another important point, and one of the last points for today that I want you all to know, is basically of how the importance of foreground and background is very necessary in a picture. Generally speaking, the background should be simple and clutter free as possible so that it doesn't pull the viewer's attention away from the main subject of the photo. But again, it all depends upon you on what kind of subjects that you are clicking. I hope you can see the picture right now on the screen, in which I've basically tried to play with the background and the foreground and about how they're coming up together. So yeah, so that's it for the today. I hope you like the points that I've covered in this video. Let me know in the comments below what all points do you want me to cover for tomorrow, and let me know your questions on about what you feel about them. Yeah, thank you.